What if I told you there was once a king so disfigured, so twisted in both body and fate that his people whispered he had been cursed by the devil himself? His name was Charles II of Spain, and history remembers him not as a ruler, but as a grotesque legend. They called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched One. Tonight you will step inside his doomed world, where royal palaces smelled like tombs and power itself became poison. And before we descend further into his cursed life, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to uncover is darker than anything you've ever learned in school. Charles was born in 1661 into the most powerful dynasty in Europe, the Habsburgs. This was a family that had ruled empires stretching across continents from Spain to Austria, from Italy to the New World. Yet, beneath their crowns lay a secret their blood was eating them alive. For generations they had married within the family to protect their power, uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, aunt to nephew. The result was a dynasty that no longer produced rulers but produced monsters. From the moment Charles opened his eyes, people knew something was wrong. His head was grotesquely large, his jaw so deformed that he could barely chew food, his tongue so swollen he could hardly speak. His body was frail, stunted, and uncoordinated. Nurses whispered that the infant would not live past a year. But he did live, though many would later say it might have been kinder if he hadn't. They believed Charles was bewitched. Servants crossed themselves when they entered his chamber. Priests were called to perform exorcisms on the boy who couldn't walk until he was 8, couldn't speak clearly until he was 4, and drooled constantly. His own mother believed that demons might have taken hold of him. But the truth was even more horrifying. It wasn't demons. It was DNA. Generations of inbreeding had stacked the odds against him. The so-called Habsburg jaw had grown monstrous in Charles, twisting his skull into unnatural proportions. His genetic makeup was so damaged that modern scientists say his family tree looked less like a tree and more like a crown of thorns looping endlessly back into itself. Charles was the final product of a dynasty that had poisoned itself through its obsession with purity. But don't imagine Charles II as merely a sad child hidden away in shadows. No, he was king. At just 4 years old, he inherited the throne of Spain, one of the richest empires in the world. Picture it, a tiny boy with watery eyes, dressed in silks, too heavy for his fragile frame, lifted onto a golden throne, before nobles who bowed, not in respect, but in terror of what he represented. The court around him became a pit of vultures. Ministers, priests, and nobles circled the weak king like predators circling a dying animal. Who controlled Charles controlled Spain, and Spain controlled half the world. His mother, Mariana of Austria, ruled as regent, guarding him fiercely. Yet even she whispered prayers at night, terrified of what her son's body signified the wrath of God upon the Habsburgs. As Charles grew, his deformities became impossible to hide. He struggled to eat solid food, surviving on a liquid diet. He staggered when he tried to walk his legs, unable to bear the weight of his swollen head. Courtiers spread rumors that he was impotent, sterile, less a man than a broken relic of a once great line. Every banquet, every ceremony became an exercise in humiliation as the king who should inspire fear inspired pity, or worse, disgust. But here's where the story twists into true horror. Charles himself began to believe the whispers. He thought he was bewitched. Every illness, every failure of his body, every defeat of Spain on the battlefield, he saw them as signs of sorcery. He ordered endless exorcisms, commanded priests to root out witches, and surrounded himself with relics meant to ward off the devil. Yet nothing could ward off his own blood. And when he finally died at the age of 38, the autopsy revealed horrors so grotesque that even hardened physicians recoiled. His body was said to be filled with pus and rot. His intestines blackened his heart the size of a walnut, his head full of water. It was as if nature itself had rebelled against him, turning his body into a vessel of decay. But to the Spanish people, it only confirmed what they had always believed: their king had been born cursed, and his curse had dragged their empire into ruin. Charles's reign was not only a personal tragedy, it was a national catastrophe. Spain, once the dominant power of Europe, was collapsing under his watch. Armies that once marched across continents were starving, unpaid, and defeated. The royal treasury was drained, yet Charles sat helpless, unable to make decisions, barely able to hold his own pen. Ministers fought over scraps of power, while foreign ambassadors described Spain as a giant body with a rotten head. In the royal court, superstition thrived. Instead of doctors, Charles summoned exorcists. Instead of strategy, he relied on omens. A flickering candle might delay a war council. A vision in a dream might alter alliances. The fate of millions rested on the fragile mind of a man who could not distinguish disease from sorcery. And those who whispered in his ear knew they could bend the king's terror into their own advantage. Priests and fortune-tellers became more influential than generals. One friar convinced Charles that he was bewitched by a French sorcerer. Another insisted that burying magical amulets in palace walls would cure him. Charles submitted to humiliating rituals, sitting naked while holy water was poured over his twisted frame, swallowing potions of herbs and powdered bones, and enduring endless prayers as his body withered further each year. Meanwhile, Europe watched like a pack of wolves circling a wounded deer. France, Austria, England. They all knew Charles would never produce an heir. The Spanish Empire, rich with gold and silver from the Americas, was about to be inherited. Every king in Europe positioned his family, preparing to snatch Spain the moment Charles drew his last tortured breath. Charles's 2 marriages only deepened the tragedy. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orleans, arrived full of youthful hope, but soon her letters home described despair. I see in him neither man nor king. She died young, broken by the hopelessness of producing children with a husband who could barely consummate the marriage. Whispers spread that she had been poisoned, but the truth was simpler. Life with Charles was a slow death in itself. His second wife, Mariana of Neuburg, fared no better. She too failed to conceive, and soon the court blamed her womb, her loyalty, her very soul. She lived in a palace thick with suspicion, knowing that every miscarriage of power would be laid upon her shoulders. But behind closed doors, she knew the truth that no one dared say aloud. The king himself was incapable of fathering a child. His body was the empire's coffin. The paranoia only deepened. Charles ordered investigations into sorcery. Trials erupted. Witches were burned, innocents tortured, all in a desperate attempt to explain away his own body's betrayal. It was easier for him to believe in dark magic than to face the truth he was the victim of his dynasty's obsession with bloodlines. At times, Charles tried to act like a true monarch. He would appear in public ceremonies draped in jewels, his face pale and distorted beneath the crown. But the effect was never majesty, it was horror. Children cried when they saw him. Foreign envoys pitied him. To his enemies, he was proof that God had abandoned Spain. To his people, he was a living reminder that power can decay flesh and soul alike. Spain's decline accelerated. Famine swept through villages, the treasury emptied, soldiers deserted. While other nations innovated, Spain remained locked in fear, its monarch clinging to holy relics as if they could prop up a collapsing world. The empire was dying in slow motion, just as its king was rotting alive on the throne. And yet the most chilling detail of all was not Charles's sickness, nor Spain's collapse. It was the silence of those around him. Everyone saw the truth. Ministers, nobles, priests, but none dared speak it. They bowed, they plotted, they pretended, all while the dynasty consumed itself. The silence of the powerful was the final nail in Spain's coffin, proving that sometimes history dies not with a bang but with a whisper. As Charles aged into his 30s, the signs of his decay became impossible to disguise. His skin grew sallow, his eyes glazed with perpetual sickness, and his speech slurred to the point that many could not understand him. At court banquets, he would sit hunched and drooling. A monarch in name only, while powerful nobles debated over his head like vultures quarreling over a carcass that was not yet cold. Foreign ambassadors sent home chilling reports. One French envoy described Charles as more dead than alive. Another wrote that his body seemed made of wax, ready to melt. These accounts spread across Europe, turning the Spanish king into a grotesque spectacle, the butt of whispered jokes in Paris and Vienna, and a warning about the dangers of royal obsession with purity. In the villages, peasants turned Charles into a ghost story. Mothers frightened their children into obedience by invoking El Hechizado. If you disobey, they whispered, the bewitched king will come for you. To the common people, their monarch was less a ruler than a living omen, proof that their suffering was the result of divine punishment upon the land. Inside the palace, the rituals of superstition grew more frantic. Charles ordered rooms searched for hidden curses. Monks circled him with incense, muttering Latin exorcisms. Holy relics were strapped to his body as if they could hold his bones together. But no prayers, no charms, no potions could undo the centuries of inbreeding that had warped his very blood. Meanwhile, the empire's enemies circled closer. France's Louis XIV prepared his armies to seize Spanish territories. Austria maneuvered its claims. England watched, waiting. Every power knew Spain's king could die at any moment, and when he did, the richest inheritance in Europe would spark a war that could consume the continent. Charles, despite his frailty, understood this looming disaster. He was terrified of leaving no heir. He prayed desperately for a miracle, begging saints for a son, a legacy. But each prayer went unanswered, and each day brought only more evidence that his dynasty's end was carved into his very bones. The Spanish court fractured into factions. Some supported Austria, others France, each side whispering into the king's ear, promising salvation, promising cures, promising loyalty. Charles could trust no one. Even his meals were suspect, tasted first by servants, yet always accompanied by the lingering fear of poison, a fear that matched his own family's history of deadly betrayals. The people outside the palace walls starved while nobles grew fat on intrigue. Bread riots erupted in Madrid. Bandits roamed the countryside, preying on peasants abandoned by their rulers. To the common Spaniard, the bewitched king was a distant shadow, incapable of saving them, incapable of even saving himself. Charles began to withdraw further into the world of sorcery and visions. He believed ghosts haunted him, that shadows moved in his chambers at night. Servants claimed he screamed in terror during midnight fits, convinced that devils clawed at his bed. Some said he refused to sleep alone, fearing he would be dragged into hell before morning. And yet the courtiers kept the machinery of monarchy running as though pretending Spain still had a future. Orders were signed in his name. Wars were waged in his name. Taxes were collected in his name. But everyone knew the truth. The king was a living corpse, and with him the empire itself was rotting alive. By the late 1690s, Charles's health had become a political countdown clock. Every cough, every fainting spell was reported across Europe like battlefield news. Diplomats whispered that the king's body was a ticking bomb, and when it finally gave out, the explosion would be continental war. Doctors swarmed the court, each with their own miracle cure. They bled him endlessly, leaving him pale as parchment. They fed him potions of crushed pearls, powdered skulls, even distilled human remains, believing such grotesque remedies might strengthen his fading spirit. Instead, they only hastened his collapse. Medicine in the 17th century was less healing than sanctioned torture. At night, the palace corridors echoed with strange chants. Exorcists were summoned again and again, commanding demons to depart from the monarch's crippled body. Charles endured hours of holy water, drenching of prayers shouted into his ears, of relics pressed against his flesh until bruises formed. He clutched crucifixes as though they might hold his body together. Still nothing changed. Rumors spread that Charles was possessed. Foreign spies exaggerated the tales, writing that Spain was ruled by a corpse, animated only by sorcery. The King of France mocked him as half-dead. In taverns across Europe, ballads described the bewitched monarch with grotesque humor, mocking the empire that once terrified the continent. Yet for Spain, the reality was not humorous at all. Famines worsened, the treasury-emptied trade faltered. The once great armadas that ruled the seas rotted in harbors, their crews unpaid, their sails tattered. The Spanish people bore the suffering while their monarch remained locked inside his haunted palace, consumed by fear and rituals. Charles's court became a theater of paranoia. Ministers accused each other of witchcraft. Servants were interrogated about hidden curses. Even members of his own family were not safe. Whispers of sorcery clung to anyone who dared oppose the dominant faction at court. The palace was less a seat of government than a stage for hysteria. In the midst of this chaos, Charles still clung to hope for a miracle heir. He begged his second wife to produce a child, though his body was incapable. Each failure deepened his despair. He began to believe that God himself had cursed the Habsburg line, and that his suffering was the price for centuries of royal pride. The courtiers, ever opportunistic, encouraged his beliefs. They told him his enemies had hexed him, that only greater faith could save him. So he prayed longer, starved himself with religious fasts, and ordered more exorcisms. His body wasted further, his face hollowing into something almost skeletal. The bewitched king was becoming a ghost in plain sight. By 1698, Charles was no longer able to rule even in appearance. He could not walk unaided, could barely chew his liquid diet, and often drifted into unconsciousness during council meetings. Ministers would lift his limp hand to sign decrees, pretending he had made decisions he could not even comprehend. The illusion of monarchy was crumbling. And then came the final humiliation. The king himself began to fear not only death, but damnation. He confessed to his priests that he believed devils circled him, waiting to drag him to hell. He begged for endless masses, demanded relics at his bedside, and spent his final months in constant terror, not of enemies abroad, but of the shadows in his own chamber. As the new century approached, the Spanish court felt less like a palace and more like a morgue. Servants tiptoed through dim corridors, terrified of disturbing the king's fragile body. Every cough was a thunderclap. Every fainting spell was a funeral rehearsal. Spain itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Foreign powers sharpened their knives. France pushed Charles to name a Bourbon heir. Austria demanded the throne pass to a Habsburg cousin. England and the Dutch Republic prepared for war regardless of his choice. The dying king's signature was no longer just ink on paper. It was the trigger for the greatest conflict Europe had seen in centuries. Charles's own paranoia only deepened. He ordered priests to open his ancestors' tombs, convinced that curses lingered in their bones. He was said to stare for hours at portraits of his forefathers, their twisted jaws and heavy brows reflecting his own deformities. It was as though he recognized himself not as a man, but as the final grotesque echo of their dynasty. By 1700, his body was a battlefield of suffering. He could not digest food properly, vomiting what little nourishment he swallowed. His skin turned pale and clammy, his legs swelled with fluid, and his eyes sank deep into his skull. The once mighty king of Spain weighed less than a child. Courtiers whispered that death itself walked beside him. And yet, even in this state, Charles was forced to perform the rituals of monarchy. He was dressed in stiff ceremonial robes that hung off his wasted body like a burial shroud. He was carried to council meetings where he slumped in his chair, trembling, barely conscious, while nobles debated wars and treaties over his head. The image was grotesque, a skeleton propped on a throne. The Spanish people, long accustomed to suffering, began to interpret his decline as divine punishment. Sermons thundered from pulpits. The king was cursed, the nation had sinned. God's wrath was upon them. Pilgrims marched barefoot to shrines, begging heaven to spare Spain. But heaven remained silent, and the king rotted further. Charles's obsession with sorcery reached its final fever. He ordered one last exorcism, the most elaborate yet. Dozens of priests gathered, chanting, sprinkling holy water, pressing relics against his trembling body. Witnesses claimed the king screamed as if demons clawed inside him, though others whispered he was simply screaming from pain. When the ritual ended, nothing had changed except Charles was closer to death. Foreign ambassadors described these scenes with horror. One wrote, "Never has a king seemed so visibly damned." Another reported that the monarch's chambers reeked of sickness and incense like a church and a charnel house combined. The bewitched king had become a living reminder that empires like men can rot from within. Finally, on November 1st, 1700, Charles II lay on his deathbed. Priests surrounded him chanting prayers, while courtiers watched with thinly veiled anticipation. Outside the palace, Madrid waited in silence, knowing the death of one broken man would ignite a war across Europe. Charles's lips moved in final prayers, though his words were barely audible. Some claimed he begged God to forgive the sins of his dynasty. Others said he begged simply not to burn in hell. When he exhaled his last breath, the silence shattered. Bells tolled across Spain, armies marched across borders, and the War of Spanish Succession began. Charles had left no heir, no legacy, no strength, only a broken body and a shattered empire. The bewitched king was dead, but his curse was only beginning. After his death, the court ordered an autopsy on Charles II. What the physicians found confirmed every whispered rumor and every fear. His body was described as a collection of horrors, his chest full of blackened organs, his intestines rotted and swollen, and his stomach so corroded it seemed as if it had been devoured from within. The most shocking detail was his heart shrunken to the size of a walnut. His lungs were filled with fluid, his body with pus. His head, grotesquely large in life, was discovered to be full of water, as though his skull had become a vessel for decay. The doctors who performed the examination were said to recoil, muttering that such a body could never have belonged to a healthy man. For the people of Spain, the autopsy was proof of supernatural punishment. To them, the bewitched king had carried demons inside his flesh, and death had simply revealed them. Priests declared that his body was a divine warning. Foreigners mocked Spain further, whispering that their monarch had been a monster both inside and out. But science tells a different and perhaps even darker truth. Modern geneticists have studied Charles's family tree and concluded that his deformities were not the work of sorcery, but of relentless inbreeding. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents cousins, and generation after generation had repeated this pattern until his DNA was fatally compromised. Charles was not cursed by demons, he was cursed by his dynasty. While the physicians dissected the corpse, the world outside exploded. The War of the Spanish Succession began almost immediately. France and Austria claimed rights to the throne, while England and the Dutch Republic sought to keep balance. Millions of lives would be lost in a war sparked by the death of a man who had lived his entire life as half dead. For ordinary Spaniards, little changed. Famine still stalked their villages, soldiers still marched unpaid, and taxes still crushed the poor. Yet now they carried the additional burden of war, all because their king had been too weak, too broken to leave behind an heir. Charles's personal tragedy became the tragedy of a continent. Foreign satirists painted grotesque images of him even after death. Pamphlets circulated showing Charles as a skeleton wearing a crown, dragging Spain into the grave with him. His name became shorthand for weakness, his reign a cautionary tale. He was remembered less as a monarch and more as a medical specimen, a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and bloodlines turned toxic. Inside Spain, however, his memory was more complicated. Some pitied him, seeing him as a victim born into a prison of flesh and expectation. Others despised him, cursing him as the king who ruined an empire. In either view, Charles was less a man than a symbol, a mirror of everything broken in the Habsburg dynasty. The war raged on, reshaping Europe. Territories changed hands, dynasties rose and fell. But in every battle, in every negotiation, the ghost of Charles II loomed. His frail body had set giants clashing, and his silence had unleashed screams across the continent. Few monarchs have ever caused such destruction by doing so little. And yet perhaps the most haunting legacy was not war nor famine nor empire. It was the question his life left behind: how much suffering can the pursuit of power justify? For the Habsburgs, the answer had been everything, even the destruction of their own blood. Charles was proof that power, when worshipped above all else, becomes its own curse. In the decades that followed, the image of Charles II haunted Europe. He became a symbol whispered in courts and classrooms, a grotesque reminder that power without wisdom can corrode not only nations, but blood itself. His reign was the final act of a dynasty that had once commanded half the world, now reduced to a fragile corpse on a throne. The War of the Spanish Succession dragged on, killing hundreds of thousands. Villages burned, cities fell, families were shattered, all because one man had been too broken to secure an heir. It was as if Charles's frailty had infected the continent, spreading suffering far beyond the walls of Madrid. Historians would later argue whether Charles was villain or victim. Was he the king who ruined Spain, or the child doomed from birth by choices he never made? In truth, he was both. He embodied the cruelty of a system that valued dynasty over humanity, purity over health, power over compassion. The Habsburg dynasty did not die with him. Branches continued in Austria, in marriages, in treaties. But the Spanish line ended. Centuries of obsession with keeping blood pure had instead produced a monarch who could not rule, could not reproduce, could not even live without pain. The irony was almost biblical. Charles's story is not just about a king, but about the silence of those around him. Ministers, priests, and nobles all saw his suffering, yet none dared to challenge the system that created it. Their silence was complicity, and in that silence Spain collapsed inward just as the king's body had collapsed upon itself. For the common people, his reign was remembered not in courtly intrigue, but in hunger and fear. They saw their king as bewitched because no other explanation seemed possible. They prayed for relief, but relief never came. To them, Charles was not just a monarch, he was a living curse walking the halls of power. The lesson of Charles II is not buried in the 17th century. It lingers today, a whisper in every system where power is hoarded, where purity is valued over diversity, where ambition blinds leaders to the suffering of their people. His body was history's warning label written in bone and blood. And perhaps the most chilling truth of all, Charles II believed he was bewitched. He carried that fear to his grave. In reality, the witchcraft was the dynasty itself. The true spell was cast not by demons, but by generations of kings and queens who chained themselves to power until their blood turned poisonous. When we look back on him now, we do not see a king in majesty. We see a man drowning in superstition, betrayed by his own body, abandoned by a system that prized control over life itself. His reign reminds us that sometimes the greatest horrors are not committed by tyrants with strength, but by dynasties that let weakness fester in silence. So remember Charles II, the bewitched king, not as a grotesque relic, but as a symbol of what happens when empires worship their own power above all else. His twisted face was the mirror of a dynasty's soul, his broken body the coffin of an empire. And perhaps the most terrifying thought is this: the silence that destroyed him is not confined to history. What horrors are we ignoring today while we tell ourselves the system will endure?